Welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and we have a brief reprieve here between spoiler seasons, I think. We probably got some coming up quick here, so for all of you that are really itching for some new commanders, I don't know how many people out there fit that category, but nevertheless, I have some new-ish commanders to talk about here, at least commanders you guys have probably never seen before. They are custom creations by my own patrons. So I have done this before, but I am just grabbing these cards. They don't know which ones I'm grabbing, and I'm going to sort of evaluate them live on my channel here, just like I would with any new commander that came out. And mostly I'm looking, I mean, there is some sort of, I guess editing issues, sort of wording things that sometimes can be incorrect that might need to be changed, but mostly it's all about fairness, right? Whenever you have custom cards, the main thing that I'm looking for is, are these cards fair? And a lot of them are going to be commanders. Some of them aren't though. So just sort of evaluating them in the commander format as well. So let's get to it. So first up, we got Daniel CG, and he has Jurihan Vengeful Spider, 2 black and a red, human berserker 4/3, death touch and haste. Pretty good combination already. I mean, if you want to be getting for the damage or attack triggers, which I think this is probably going to end up being, definitely a great combination there. Whenever Jurihan Vengeful Spider enters the battlefield or attacks, put a Kai counter on her or remove one from her. When you remove a counter this way, choose one. So this is, first of all, we have the Kai counters, which were from Kamigawa. So there might be some, I don't know if there's any cards that deal with Kai counters other than the actual creatures that are dealing with it, but might be able to move them around maybe. So that is a little bit significant. Also, you're doing the thing that the Guile Street Fighter commander's doing. I can't remember the name of the reprint, but it was originally Guile, where you're either adding or removing counters. So that same sort of build there. So when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you put a counter on it. So it's not going to have a counter on it right away. So when it enters the battlefield, you got to put a counter on it. But because it has haste, it can immediately attack, and then you can immediately remove that counter. But then it's not going to have any counters on it, so the next turn you're going to have to attack just to put a counter on it. So whenever you remove a counter, you have 2 options. Deal 3 damage to any target, that's always great. Or attacking creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain first strike until end of turn. Pretty darn good. So yeah, I think this is totally fair. I mean, if we're talking about, is this a fair commander? Is it overpowered? Nah. It's pretty, like I said, the fact that you have to, I mean, yes, you can immediately have it enter the battlefield and then attack, remove a counter, shoot something, or buff your whole team. I guess the interesting part here is you could maybe do Death Touch Tribal because your commander has Death Touch. And then if you put a bunch of other Death Touch creatures in here, those attacking creatures will get first strike if you use your commander's ability, which means they'll have first strike and death touch, which is a fantastic combination. So that's pretty interesting. So you could do a death touch tribal here. Obviously your commander has death touch, so the 3 damage to any target is going to immediately kill a creature. Is that too good? I don't think so. I mean, 4 mana, essentially this is 4 mana kill a creature, which is not great. Obviously your commander is going to remain on the table. Again, though, the next turn you have no counters on your commander, so you got to attack with it just to get a counter on it, so that you can then reload and fire away at another creature the next turn. You could do Conjurer's Closet, you could do proliferate effects. Obviously, there are build around things you can do there. I think it's totally fair, though. All right, let's move on to Flapdack. ShackKirk Skeletal Initiate. 2 and a green, Troll Shaman 1/4. Whenever a skeleton card is put into a graveyard, you may draw a card. Wow, that's really good. Whenever a skeleton, so this is even if your opponents have skeletons that are dying. But of course, you're going to want to do Skeleton Tribal here. This looks like it's mono green. Oh, but it has daybound, so that means it has a backside. Whenever an opponent casts no spells during their own turn, they may gain 3 life and draw 3 cards. What the? Okay, so this has daybound, which means, of course, if a player casts no spells during their own turns, it becomes night. So if an opponent casts no spells, you're encouraging your opponents to cast no spells here, which is interesting, right? If an opponent casts no spells during their turn, they gain 3 life and draw 3 cards, which of course is fantastic. But It's going to trigger your day bounce, so that means you get to flip your commander, which is that's kind of a neat build here. I mean, whenever a skeleton is put into a graveyard, you get to draw a card. That's really good too. So your opponent is maybe encouraging you to flip your commander because that front side's pretty good. They also get to draw 3 cards and gain 3 life. I guess it really depends what the backside looks like, so let's take a look. ShackKirk, Caller of the Cult, and of course the backside is black, which you kind of need for Skeleton Tribal, so you are going to be a black-green deck here, and it's a Skeleton Shaman 4/1, and has Menace. Other skeletons you control get +3/+0. Okay, that's really good. Pay 2 and a black, tap, return target skeleton card in your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So again, the editing issue here, what would be the wording here? Return target skeleton card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Yeah, not in your graveyard, it'd be from your graveyard. Also, I think you might want to say skeleton creature card, because you can have a changeling card. So like a nameless inversion, for example, that's a skeleton card because it has every creature type. So you could use this to return nameless inversion from your graveyard to the battlefield, which of course wouldn't do anything because it would just go right back to the graveyard, I believe is the rules there. This might be too good. I'm thinking, okay, like the backside, all your skeletons get +3/+0. Wow. So all those, I mean, most skeletons I think are going to be 1/1s. So now they're all going to be 4/1s. Oof, that's a really good anthem. You're obviously encouraging your opponents to flip your commander over because that can be tough to do with this nightbound, daybound stuff. But the front side is even really good. Whenever a skeleton is put into a graveyard, you may draw a card. And again, the wording there, so this is skeleton card put into a graveyard. Again, the wording there, like if this is a skeleton card, that means it's not a permanent. So I don't know if you did this on purpose, but if you just say skeleton card, and I talked about this in my recent wrong card video, skeleton card is not a permanent. If you're talking about skeletons going from the, no, it is a permanent because that is a card as well, right? Yeah, okay. This is like compost, so it's like my last wrong cards video, right? A card refers to anything going into the graveyard. Obviously, tokens don't work here, right? So I guess that's probably why you use the wording skeleton card. But also put into a graveyard from anywhere. That's the part that needs to be clarified here. If it's put into a graveyard from, like if it gets milled into your graveyard to get the draw card, because if that's the case, that's really, really good. Probably that would make it too good. You probably just want to say whenever a skeleton card is put into, like I would probably just say whenever a skeleton dies, draw a card. That's what I would put here. Saying I guess non-token skeleton. If you don't want to include the skeletons, again, if you're trying to make this not as good, whenever a non-token skeleton dies, draw a card. That's how I would word this ability. Because when you say skeleton card, obviously you don't want to include tokens, but you're saying put into a graveyard, which means it can be put in a graveyard from anywhere, which means you can just discard it or mill it or something like that, right? That probably would make this too good. It's already really good. Even just having whenever your non-token skeletons die, you get to draw a card. That's already really good. And then again, I like the encouraging your opponents to flip your commander over. That's pretty neat. I mean, the fact that your opponents can draw 3 cards off of your commander definitely does make it not nearly as good. This is a tough one. I think I would make it, probably cost a little more. 2 and a green is pretty cheap here. I don't know. You guys let me know what you think. How fair is this commander? It's definitely an interesting one to evaluate. All right, next up we got Imp with a non-creature or non-legendary creature, so this isn't a commander. Burning Remembrance, 1 red and a white enchantment. If another permanent card we put into a graveyard from anywhere. Okay, so now again, funny enough, we have that anywhere wording there. Instead, exile it and put a lament counter on Burning Remembrance. So if a permanent card, so again, this can be, because it says card, it has to be the type permanent, right? So it can be a permanent from the battlefield, that is a permanent card, but it also can be a permanent type that is being milled, because it's put into the graveyard from anywhere. So it is a card being put into the graveyard from anywhere, but it has to be a card that is the permanent type. So artifact, enchantment, creature, land, planeswalker. Those are the permanent types, right? So it has to be one of those. You instead exile it So this is a replacement effect, right? So it's going to replace dies, triggers, and all that stuff. So anything going into the graveyard that is a permanent, that is the type permanent, is going to get exiled instead, and you're going to put a lament counter on this. So it's going to be getting counters on it really, really fast. When Burning Remembrance leaves the battlefield, it deals X damage to each player, where X is the number of... Wow. Oh boy, this is interesting. So this is going to sit there, and it's just going to be exiling all the permanents as they go into graveyards, right? Because this is any permanent, any graveyard. And then, and like I said, it's going to be piling the counters on it really, really quickly. And when it leaves the battlefield, so of course that means it leaving the battlefield in any way, even if it gets exiled, it deals X damage to each player, where X is the number of lament counters on it. I mean, it's sort of like this ticking time bomb that is just going to blow everybody up, right? I mean, you could, it would make the game very interesting for sure, because a lot of players, like if you're worried about your life total, you're going to want to get this off the battlefield before it gets too high. This would work really good. You know, if I'm putting this in a deck, I'm going to put it in a life gain deck. I'm going to put this in a Boros life gain deck, or any red-white deck that is gaining lots of life, because I don't care. Now I can just go nuts, and I'm going to take 30 damage from this. Don't care. I'm fine because I got 60 life, right? That's probably where this would be a good fit. Really interesting card. Is it a bit much? Like, it would be interesting to see how quickly the counters pile on this. Every time a creature dies, it gets a counter. Every time, stuff gets milled, it gets counters. When artifacts and enchantments get blown up, it's going to get counters on it. So it is going to get counters on it pretty quick. Someone cracks an Evolving Wilds, that's going to put a counter on this, right? So not sure if they took that into consideration or not, but this thing's going to get counters piled on it really quick. It would make a game very interesting, that's for sure. Next up, we got Dan, and he has a really interesting one here. Riot, 2 red, red, red enchantment. Again, so not a commander, and it has the set symbol from one of my favorite sets there, Planar Chaos. And I think it is suiting here. All creatures are goated. That's interesting. So permanently goated, which is in itself really, really good. Okay, because what this card does is it essentially means you can't be attacked, right? At least if there's more than 2 players around, it means you can't get attacked. Whenever a creature becomes blocked, untap it. Then the attacking and defending player exchange control of those creatures. This is a very red feeling enchantment, right? There's actually lots of really wacky red enchantments. I did a video about it, crazy red enchantments. And funny enough, I'm going to continue doing that series talking about all the other colors. The red ones, though, the reason why I did that in particular to start with was because there's just so many incredibly wacky red enchantments out there that are doing similar things like this, okay? And a lot of them have to do with combat. So whenever a creature becomes blocked, you untap it. So all creatures are goaded, so there's going to be a lot of attacking going on. Obviously, if you just let that creature get through, nothing happens. If it becomes blocked, though, you're going to untap it. Then the attacking and defending player exchange control of those creatures. The weird rules interaction here is damage going to get done? I'm not sure. Again, I don't know if the wording is correct here. Do you want those creatures to be removed from combat? I think if you exchange control of creatures, do they get removed from combat? I actually don't know the answer to that. Then the attacking and defending player exchange. So we're going to need some rules lawyers in the comments here to explain how this would work. So the attacking and defending players exchange control of their creatures. Also, what if there's multiple blockers? The blockers, if you had 5 blockers, would they all get exchanged? I mean, obviously you wouldn't do that because then your opponent would gain control of all of them. Oh boy. Yeah, I don't know. Does the damage still go through? That's the part that I'm not sure about. Someone can let me know in the comments below. I don't know what happens there. If creatures exchange control in combat, do they get removed from combat, or does that keep going? I would think they would get removed from combat. Interesting. Also, though, at the beginning of each end step, if any player controls no creatures they own, sacrifice Riot, and each player gains control of all creatures they own. Okay, so that's going to kind of put things back to normal, right? So at any point, if you've gained a bunch of control of all your opponent's creatures, but now you no longer control any of your own creatures, or I guess if someone just cast a board wipe, right? If somebody casts a board wipe, that means that player at the end of that turn, unless they cast another creature right after, but typically that's probably going to mean that player's not going to control any creatures they own because they don't control any creatures. So that's going to get rid of the riot. So getting rid of the riot is not that difficult. You can get rid of it through normal removal means, but there's lots of other ways. Just casting a board wipe will probably get rid of it. So that's good. It is going to make the game very interesting, no question. But again, there are lots of cards like this already. Again, the only thing here, I think this is probably fair. The only thing here is the rules interactions. It might be tricky. All right, next up, Sea Turtle Wizard has Kaldris the Unsparring? 2 black, red, white, and a green. So another 4-color commander. We don't have many of those in the format. This would be the second one of this color combination. Elder Dragon, 4/4. So it's an Elder Dragon, great. Flying in haste, Kaldris the Unsparring has indestructible as long as it entered the battlefield this turn. So that's pretty good. So you can attack with it right away. So you're guaranteed getting an attack here, right? And this isn't a really expensive commander, and only a 4/4. So you bring it into play right away. You're going to attack with it right away. It has indestructible immediately. It has flying, so hard to block. What's the payoff here? At the end of each combat, destroy all blocking creatures and all block creatures? I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting a deal damage trigger or something. At the end of each combat, well, that is a really powerful ability, though. The other stuff, I don't know if it plays into... I guess the thinking here is, so you attack with your commander at the end of combat. If your commander was blocked, you're going to destroy all blocking creatures and all block creatures. But, of course, your commander's indestructible, so it'll be fine. But your commander has flying. It feels like what I talked about with Chromium, how Chromium has Rampage and Flying. You have 2 abilities there. One is an evasion ability, and the other is a ability where you kind of want your Rampage kind of works better if your commander's blocked, so they don't work really well together. This sort of the same way. I mean, it's a dragon, so of course it kind of has to have flying, but it's maybe a little bit of a non-bow here because you kind of want your commander to enter the battlefield, have indestructible, and have it be blocked. And if it has flying, what I want to do with this deck is I want to put a lure type of effect in here. Put lure on my Kaldris, cast it, put lure on it, and then attack with it. My opponent has to block with all their creatures. I mean, maybe that's too good. My opponent has to block with all their creatures. My commander's indestructible because it just entered the battlefield. And then at the end of combat, you're going to destroy all your opponent's creatures. That seems pretty good. I mean, it's not super easy to get off, especially because your commander's so expensive. That's a whole lot of mana, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, plus the lure is 3. That's 9 mana to destroy all your opponent's creatures. So if that's the thinking here, the flying actually hurts you a little bit because, of course, any of your opponent's creatures aren't going to be able to block at all. So the lure isn't going to work there. You're only going to destroy the flying creatures. So it is a neat way to destroy any flying creatures in play, I suppose. But just your commander sitting on the battlefield, and at the end of each combat, you're destroying all blocking creatures and all block creatures is certainly going to make the game interesting. I mean, is this fair? Absolutely, I think it is. It's a powerful ability, but your commander is 4 colors and costs 6 mana and doesn't have a lot of huge other upsides, I don't think. So sure, I'm okay with it. And I'm going to end off with your sponsor because this guy's always got an absolute ton on my Discord. By the way, this is where I get them from, right? These are all from my patrons, and I have a channel on my Discord where all my patrons put their own creations. So if you're interested in that, you can join my Patreon and get talking about all the interesting commanders on there. There's a bunch. I just grabbed a few. There's a whole bunch more. I can only talk about so many. So Gear Per Caretaker. This is not a legendary creature, just a human artificer, but I thought it was an interesting one. 1 and a white, and it's a 1/2. Activated abilities of artifacts with mana value 2 or less cost 1 more to activate. That's pretty interesting in a commander game, right? So, typically you see that aren't mana abilities. This includes mana abilities, right? Activated abilities of artifacts with mana value 2 or less. So this is going to affect the mana rocks more than anything. And what it does probably better than anything is it essentially shuts off treasures, right? Because a treasure has an activated ability, right? It's a mana ability, but it is an activated ability. It's an artifact, obviously, and its mana value is 2 or less, so it's going to cost 1 more to activate. So you're going to pay 1 to act. I guess your treasure would become just mana swapping. You could use any mana to produce any mana of any color, right? That's essentially all that your treasures are going to do. They're not going to give you a boost. You're going to pay colorless mana to make, a mana of any color, essentially. So it filters mana, right? That's all that treasure tokens are going to do. Your Soul Ring is now going to essentially tap for 1 mana. You'll have to pay 1 mana to then have it tap for 2 mana. So that becomes a lot worse. Your Arcane, any mana rock that is tapping to add 1 mana is essentially just completely worthless, right? And then on top of that, all the other activated abilities of artifacts. So is this too much? I mean, what else does it do? Well, you can add a colorless mana. Okay, activate only if an opponent controls more artifacts than you. So this guy just really doesn't like artifacts, I guess. So a mana dork as well, that only works if your opponent controls a lot of artifacts. So totally fair, that part, I think. Is this too good? I don't think so. I think it's okay. White has a lot of really great hate cards. You could put Stony Silence in your deck, and that's just going to shut off all artifacts, and that costs 2 mana, and it's an enchantment. Probably a lot harder to get off the table, so I think this is totally fair. People aren't going to love it, but I think it's totally fair. All right, another one from your sponsor, Arak the Asgolin Maw. Black, red, green, and a white. So interestingly enough, another commander of that color combination. It is a legendary creature. It's a worm. It's an 8/8. That is a really cheap 8/8. So hopefully there's some downside here. Trample, protection from instant spells. Oh boy. So an 8/8 with trample that has protection from instant spells. We better see some downsides here. Whenever an opponent activates an ability of a permanent they don't control, you and that player each create a 4/4 green worm creature token with trample. Oh boy. Whenever they activate an ability of a permanent they don't control. Oh, that's funny. And of course, we have an ability here, pay 4 life. You gain protection from worms till end of turn. Any player may activate this ability. I think what he wants to do here is have it so that the player who activates this ability gains protection from worms until end of turn. And then when they do so, this is an ability that they don't control that they're activating, right? Those two abilities play into each other. So they're going to create a worm, right? So they pay 4 life, they get a worm, you get a worm, and then they gain protection from worms until end of turn, which of course is what's going to make your commander not so good. And the other really interesting part about this, of course, is that middle ability there, whenever an opponent activates an ability of a permanent they don't control, can be used with lots of other things, like Volros Dungeon is one that comes to mind. That I can't remember exactly, but it's like pay 5 life to destroy it or something. Lethal Vapors is another one that does this. You could throw those cards in the deck as well. Those cards that usually they have like a really horrible downside, but any player may activate that ability. What's that green creature that has like hexproof and any player can activate the ability to turn the hexproof off or something like that? You could throw all that. It makes this a really, really interesting build around. So that, is it too much though? Like you're going to have players activating all those abilities and there's going to be worms popping up all over the place. I don't know. This is really tough. This is one of those commanders that you'd almost have to see it in action in order to properly evaluate it. Really, really interesting. Again, the only stipulation here is I think the wording on that last ability doesn't work. I think it would probably be fixed by saying each player gains protection from worms until end of turn. I think that would probably fix it. And the last one I'm going to look at today, again from your sponsor, this guy comes up with some really, really interesting ones. Pia Finality Accelerant. And I mean, just look at this casting cost. Again, a 4-color commander. So we have the 2, but with the red, so the hybrid mana there. So you don't have to pay the red. You can pay 2 black, green, and a blue. So that would be 5 mana, but you don't need red. Still, though, obviously it's going to be a 4-color commander. Or you can just pay the red, black, blue, and a green. So then you're paying only 4 mana, which you probably are going to do with this deck. It's a legendary creature, human wizard 3/3. You may skip your beginning phase. Okay, so to clarify for everyone, I think there's a couple of cards now that refer to beginning phase. Sphinx of the Second Sun being the one that comes to mind. Beginning phase means your untap, upkeep, and draw. That's what that means. So you would skip your untap, upkeep, and draw, which, of course is brutal because you don't get an untap, right? I guess how this would work is as soon as your turn starts, because your untap is at the start of your turn, this is giving you the option to skip all that stuff. So you would go right to your first main phase, right? Your pre-combat main phase. That's awful because you obviously don't get the untap. The upkeep might be a good thing because usually there's a lot of bad things that happen on your upkeep. Sometimes not. Obviously, you skip your draw as well, which is really bad. If you do untap all creatures you control. Okay, so you do get to untap your creatures. You don't get to untap your lands, though. That's the really bad part. Don't get to untap your artifacts, right? After the first end phase of this turn, there is an additional main phase followed by an additional... Oh, boy. Man, you're giving me the gears here with these. After the first end phase. So, first of all, I don't think it's called end phase. It's end step. So after the first end step of this turn, there is an additional main phase followed by an additional end step. So what's going to happen is, so how this is going to work is you're going to skip your beginning phase. You're going to skip your untap, upkeep, draw, right? I think you would definitely want Sphinx of the Second Sun in here just to be on the safe side, right? So that you actually would get a beginning. Boy, that would be interesting. I'm not even going to get into what a turn's going to look like if you have this commander with Sphinx of the Second Sun. Someone else can figure that out. So you're going to skip your untap, upkeep, draw, right? All your creatures are going to untap. That's great. I guess you would probably want a lot of mana dorks in this deck because your lands aren't untapping. That's brutal. After the first, so what's going to happen is you skip all that, you get your first main phase, then you get combat, then you get your second main phase, then you would go to your end step, right? And after the first end step, so I think the wording here has to change. At the beginning of the next end step of this turn, there is an additional main phase followed by an additional end phase. So, I mean, I haven't looked at that last ability yet, but why would you want to do this? Because you don't get you don't get your untap, upkeep, draw. Your lands won't untap, although your creatures do. Again, you would need a lot of mana dorks. You get combat, then you would get your second main phase, but probably all your stuff is tapped at this point. And then you're going to get an end phase, Wilderness Reclamation. Is that, maybe you're thinking of that card will be great because that Wilderness Reclamation untaps all your land on your end step. Bam, there you go. So I guess that's one way you could get around this, but that's one card in the 99. We haven't even gotten to the last ability yet. At the beginning of your end step. Okay, so again, you're using the end step word here, the end step term. You should have used it in the first one, right? So at the beginning of your end step, untap up to 2 target permanents. Then target player loses 3 life and draws 2 cards. Oh my goodness. I should have made a video just about this creature, and this should have been one video about this card and no others because there's so much going on here. Okay, so you're gonna get 2 end steps. So at the beginning of your end step, your first end step, you're gonna, if you choose to use that first ability, again, it is an option, so you don't have to do any of that. You can just not do any of that first stuff, and at the beginning of your end step, untap up to 2 target permanents. That's pretty good, not bad. You can untap your lands there. You can untap maybe a Thran Dynamo or something, Gilded Lotus, something that taps for a lot of mana. Then target player loses 3 life, which of course you can point at an opponent or you can do it yourself and draws 2 cards. So the draw 2 cards gets around the fact that you're losing your draw step. Okay, so assuming we just use this all on ourselves, right? Let's go through this. We skip our untap, upkeep, draw. All of our lands are probably still tapped, but we're going to untap our creatures. Our mana rocks are untapped. I wouldn't even put any mana rocks in this deck because it's going to be really hard to untap them, right? I would just put creatures that tap for mana. Lots of mana dorks, specifically the ones that tap for more than 1 mana. You're going to get your main phase, your combat, your second main phase. Then you're going to go to your end step. You're going to untap 2 permanents, which I would imagine are going to be lands probably. And then target player is going to lose 3 life and draw 2 cards, and that's probably going to be you. So you're getting an extra card draw, but you're losing 3 life. Then you're going to get another main phase, and you just untap 2 permanents, so you will be able to get to do a little bit of stuff, not much. Assuming you untap 2 lands, you have like 2 mana, maybe. If you untap 2 mana dorks, same thing, maybe a little bit. 2, 3 mana, maybe 4 tops. And then you're going to get another end phase after that, in which case you can then untap 2 more permanents and lose 3 more life and draw 2 more cards, or maybe have another. Oh boy, this is almost an impossible. As far as the rules go, I don't know if a lot of this is like there is definitely some wording that might need to change here. As far as actually playing this is almost impossible to evaluate unless you actually see it in action. I would love it. I would love to see this card in action. Buddy, build this deck and I will absolutely play against you in a command. You know, I would love to see it. And I encourage it for any of my patrons that are watching and for any of you guys that are thinking about, you know, I've played a couple of patrons now on my Discord, on my Patreon that had these custom commanders like this. I encourage it. And I'm like, let's see what happens. I would love to see what happens with this commander. I encourage someone to run out there and build this deck, and I will absolutely play against them on my Patreon or on my Discord with this. And I'm sure a lot of my other patrons would have no problem with it as well. I would love to see how this plays out. I would love to see how this commander plays out because, holy man, this is complex. How would you build this deck? Really interesting. Is it fair? Gee, I guess. Again, super hard to evaluate. You really got to see it in action. But that is it. That's all. That's it for today. Some really interesting stuff here. Again, some of these commanders, I probably could have made a whole video talking about them. There's some pretty interesting ones. Let me know what you guys think in the comments about them. What maybe needs to be tweaked to make them more fair, or the wording here. There are a couple of commanders here, a couple of cards here even, that I think the rules issues might come into effect. Let me know in the comments below if you guys have the answer to those questions. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.